class, continuing my lecture on Vietnam, the 1960s, and early 70s, and Richard Nixon. So I'll pick up where I left off. Nixon had just become president. Domestically, Richard Nixon really didn't care all that much. He once said, or he was known to say, America can run itself. And his real passion was foreign policy, and Nixon preferred to defer to the Democrats who controlled Congress on the domestic agenda, hoping to get credit for signing legislation they had passed. Nixon ended up being the most liberal Republican by far since liberal Republican president by far since Theodore Roosevelt in the early 20th century. Some of the landmark legislation that was passed on his watch included much of the landmark environmental legislation of the 1970s, including the Clean Air Act of 1970 and the Endangered Species Act, passed in 1974. Also, the Environmental Administration agency, the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, was created on his watch, and he signed the legislation that established it. Also, a labor protection, a labor safety organization, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, was created with his signature. Nixon signed legislation supporting food stamps, Meals on Wheels. He was a strong proponent of American Indian tribal sovereignty, and is something of a hero to many American Indian people to this day for that. Perhaps surprisingly, he supported a guaranteed minimum family income program that would have guaranteed families a certain specified minimum income per year, even if they didn't work. That was actually more radical than anything any liberal president or Democratic president I can think of has ever proposed. And this was supported by numerous Democrats in Congress, but it never passed. Nixon supported economic stimulus, government stimulus programs, and in 1971, he even imposed wage and price controls to try to deal with the stagflation problem of that year. And when he did that, he announced, "I'm a Keynesian." He was always a fan of the liberal economic theorist who believed in government stimulus to the economy. He supported something like Obamacare. I guess maybe it would have been called Nixon Care. That would have provided guaranteed health insurance for all Americans. But turning to Nixon's real passion, foreign policy. Nixon worked closely with his top foreign policy advisor, Dr. Henry Kissinger, who had for many years been a political science professor at Harvard. Henry Kissinger was a German Jew. He had emigrated because of the rise of Hitler and the Nazis. He and his family had emigrated to the U.S. from Germany in the late 1930s. And Kissinger was a brilliant theorist. He headed the NSA for Nixon and also the State Department. First the NSA and then later, first the National Security Council, the NSC, and then later he became Secretary of State. Kissinger and Nixon believed in a doctrine that they called realpolitik, that stressed the real interests of nations, and that stressed dealing with nations as they were as opposed to trying to reform them. So, for instance, accepting the Soviets essentially as they were, not trying to preach human rights to the Soviets, not trying to reform them, but instead trying to deal with them as they were, and see what kind of interests that they had that see how we could sort of match their interests and make deals that were advantageous to both countries. The Nixon doctrine in foreign policy emphasized the pursuit of American interests in foreign policy. Again, as opposed to sort of more of a crusader mentality, the idealism of Woodrow Wilson or a Barry Goldwater. As president, Nixon pursued a détente, or an easing of tensions with the Soviets, and achieved SALT I, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, which limited nuclear weapons with the Soviets. Probably Richard Nixon's most famous foreign policy initiative, and one that he worked on very secretively, he and Kissinger worked on very secretively, and through Pakistan as kind of a back channel, even keeping his initiatives secret from his own Secretary of State and the State Department as much as he could. This initiative was opening China. Nixon and Kissinger realized that there were major differences between the People's Republic of China and the Soviet Union that could be exploited, and that by exploiting those differences and developing relations with China, the U.S. could drive a wedge between China and Russia and help ease Cold War tensions, and also help apply pressure on the Soviet Union. Nixon famously went to China in 1972, and the U.S. has maintained diplomatic relations with China since that time, which it had not had since the People's Republic of China was declared in 1949. So that was probably Nixon's most notable foreign policy achievement, was the establishment of relations with China. In terms of Vietnam, Nixon's greatest foreign policy and defense challenge throughout his presidency, he indeed did not have a secret plan to end the war in Vietnam. And he ended up essentially adopting the strategy that Johnson had used in the last 2 years of his administration, which essentially involved devolving power in the conflict, devolving responsibility to the South Vietnamese themselves. Nixon called this policy Vietnamization, and there was a domestic political calculus to all this. Nixon wanted very much to ease the anger over Vietnam, to ease the protests, and to help himself politically by doing so. But at the same time, he did not want to appear weak on Vietnam. He did not want to appear to be conceding the war effort and thus look soft on communism. And he didn't want to look like he was losing the war either. So it was a delicate balancing act that Nixon tried to pursue with his Vietnamization. On the one hand, he was drawing down American force levels throughout his presidency. On the other hand, he didn't want to just have a ceasefire. And he searched for something that he called peace with honor, which essentially meant that Nixon did not want to appear to be giving in to the demands of Ho Chi Minh and the North Vietnamese. He applied pressure through bombing campaigns, some of them rather massive. He had launched a massive bombing campaign called the Christmas Bombings, right around Christmas of 1972, which inspired major anti-war protests. He also launched an incursion into Cambodia, where North Vietnamese troops were believed to be, in late April of 1970. And we ended up fighting in Laos and Cambodia. So Nixon really kind of tried to have it both ways on Vietnam. He was ramping down our war effort and drafting fewer Americans into the war effort, but at the same time, he was trying to not lose the war. In January of 1973, he achieved a ceasefire, probably along about the same lines that he could have, or along the same terms that he could have achieved when he first became president 4 years earlier. But of course, about 20,000 Americans lost their lives within that period. In April of 1975, South Vietnam fell, and the country has been a communist country, ruled from the north ever since. So it's unclear really what Nixon achieved beyond being able to say he hadn't lost the war in those years. At home, Nixon tried to exploit the divisions, the deep divisions in American society, especially between traditionalists and those seeking change, particularly radical change. He tried to exploit those divisions for political gain. That was essentially his shtick. In 1970, he went around the country campaigning for Republicans, and he tried to paint the Democrats as essentially violent and unpatriotic, the party of the anti-Vietnam protest movement. Didn't really work. Democrats gained seats in the midterm election. They gained, I think, 9 seats in the House. In 1972, Nixon got lucky and faced a relatively weak and bumbling candidate in Senator George McGovern of South Dakota. McGovern apparently was a nice and decent man, but he really fumbled badly in the campaign. And he was also pretty extreme. He was probably about as far to the left as Goldwater had been to the right in 1964. And Nixon was basically able to label McGovern as an unsafe extremist and label him as the candidate of acid, amnesty, and abortion. And Nixon won in a landslide, which makes Watergate really look pretty ridiculous and unnecessary. Nixon certainly didn't need to engage in the shenanigans of Watergate in order to win in that election. Richard Nixon, as president, faced the first bad economy of the post-war era. He was the first American president to face a weakened economy since FDR. Stagflation, a combination of high unemployment and high inflation, which was in part a result of the high spending on the Vietnam War primarily by Lyndon Johnson, gripped the country in the early 1970s. and then the country was hit with the OPEC oil embargo in October of 1973, which drove up oil prices and caused long lines to form at the gas pumps all over the country. And so Nixon had to deal with economic challenges that his immediate predecessors had not had to face. And as I mentioned earlier, he tried to manage the economy by imposing wage and price controls in 1971, but those proved pretty ineffective. So finally, turning to Watergate, which would be the undoing, the Watergate scandal, which would be the undoing of Richard Nixon's political career and his presidency. The scandal really had its origins in Nixon's and Kissinger's obsession with government leaks especially from within the executive branch. And so they formed a group called the Plumbers that was a response to the Pentagon Papers leak. And the Plumbers was a group that was supposed to stop leaks. The Pentagon Papers was a vast trove of material, largely from the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, that Daniel Ellsberg had leaked to the New York Times, that really showed the internal thinking and internal machinations about the Vietnam War during the Kennedy and Johnson administrations. But Nixon had become obsessed by the Pentagon Papers and decided then and there that he needed to do extra things to try to stop leaks in the future. The initial Watergate break-in into the Watergate apartment complex in Washington, D.C. occurred in May of 1972, but the plumbers weren't caught in that break-in. They went back again to break into the Democratic National Committee's headquarters in June of 72. This time, however, they were caught. In January of 1973, grand jury indictments were issued against Howard Hunt and G. Gordon Liddy, two of the Watergate burglars. In March of 73, another one of the burglars, McCord, began to spill what he knew. A Senate investigating committee, a special committee, was established to investigate Watergate, with Democrat Sam Ervin of North Carolina serving as the chair of the committee. And the committee, over the summer of 1973, discovered evidence of hush money that was paid out by the Nixon administration to keep the Watergate burglars quiet, wiretapping, and of a secret taping system in the Oval Office that Nixon used to record many of his conversations. Nixon probably made his biggest mistakes, and the mistakes that ultimately cost him his presidency, with his efforts to cover up the Watergate break-in. And particularly in offering hush money to keep the lid on the case, and also, and probably even worse, by his ordering of the CIA to halt the FBI investigation into the Watergate break-in, which was found out, and of course was amounted to an attempt to obstruct justice. A battle developed over the release of the White House tapes. A special counsel was appointed to investigate Watergate. On October 20th, 1973, the so-called Saturday Night Massacre occurred, in which Nixon fired the Attorney General when he wouldn't fire the special prosecutor, and then fired Ruckelshaus, the Deputy Attorney General, when he refused to do it. And he finally got to the third man, a guy named Robert Bork, of whom we would hear more later, who would fire the special counsel. And this looked very bad and helped seal Nixon's fate. Nixon, of course, ordered the Saturday Night Massacre. On March 1st, 1974, 7 members of the Committee to Re-elect the President, former committee, and White House staffers, and including Nixon, who was an unindicted co-conspirator, were indicted in charges pursuant to Watergate. In July of 74, the Supreme Court said that Nixon had to hand over the White House tapes. Then between July 27th and July 30th, a House committee voted to impeach the president. Finally, right before Nixon resigned, GOP leaders from the Senate, including Barry Goldwater, went to Nixon and told him the gig's up, and we don't have the votes to protect you, and you will get impeached and removed from office. And then on August 8th, 1974, Richard M. Nixon became the first American president to resign from office. He was succeeded by his vice president, Gerald R. Ford, who was the first unelected vice president ever to become president. Ford had been appointed vice president by Nixon when Spiro Agnew had been forced to resign due to tax evasion. Ford was very popular on Capitol Hill, where he had served as a Republican congressman from Michigan for many years. However, and his ascension to the presidency promised a better relationship between the White House and Congress. But Ford's decision to pardon Richard Nixon in September of 1974 was quite unpopular with the American people, and helped ensure Ford's defeat when he ran for election in his own right in 1976. So, the legacies of this tumultuous period in American history, beginning with Lyndon Johnson's decision to escalate in Vietnam in 1965, and ending with Richard Nixon's resignation from office following the Watergate scandal in August of 1974. So what are the legacies of this tumultuous period in American life? Well, I would say that the Vietnam War and the protest movement that it inspired, with all of its excesses, and the Watergate scandal, coupled with the stagflation that brought the long economic gains of the post-war era to an end, and the long period of uninterrupted prosperity, along with the OPEC oil embargo, which led to a lack of cheap gasoline, which Americans had come to see as a birthright for the first time in decades. All of this led to a dimming of American optimism and confidence that had been so pronounced in the 50s and the early to mid 60s of JFK's New Frontier and LBJ's Great Society. The grand expectations that Jim Patterson references in his textbook on the period no longer seemed quite so grand to many Americans. And we were entering an era of limits, both real physical limits and also limits in terms of expectations. Government, politicians, authority figures in general, following Vietnam and Johnson's credibility gap over Vietnam and Nixon's many lies during the Watergate scandal. Respect for authority was no longer as great, and government and politicians no longer enjoyed the trust that they once had in American society. Nothing like the trust that they had had in the 1950s and early 1960s. Despite the relative sourness of the early to mid 1970s, however, there was still a lot of good feeling left in the country. I don't want you to have the sense that everything was completely sour and hopeless in the country at that time. But there was a diminution of the grand expectations that people had felt. Also, there was a rise of backlash against the so-called liberal establishment and the excesses of the 1960s. And the forces of the backlash, I would argue, have been with us ever since, and have been surfed by different politicians successfully right up to our own current era. And also, and finally, in closing, it's worth noting, however, that despite the sourness of the era, for many groups of Americans, such as blacks and women, things were looking a little bit more hopeful by the early 70s than they had before. Thanks.